slow this down is to block dopamine production coming in here so that we're knocking this out to compensate for that. Does that make some sense? The only reason I'm bringing in this to show you is for you to understand how some of these drugs deal with these pathways. In essence, the signals coming from the cortex, okay, are going to be both direct and indirect. The signals coming out are all going to be thalamic, going back to the cortex. But all of these two pathways together are still moderating the same movement. So if I do this, there's both direct and indirect signaling involved. And it's that interaction between direct signaling and indirect signaling that gives you some degree of control over the amount of movement. So when we're losing this, and once again, we're losing it on one side. It's the implication here isn't that this is one side or the other side. It's just with hemiballismus, typically the lesion is only on one side. So you're going to have your problem on the opposite side. Does this make some sense to you? Yeah?
I was writing when you said it. So you block the dopamine and then it stops the other side, or what?
No, what's happened here is, you have to remember, these are all involved with this movement, let's say, okay? If I just knock this out, I lose this inhibition, which means I get this excitation and that excitation, which means I get too much excitation. Are we okay with that?
Yeah.
Okay. By blocking the dopaminergic input here, I slow down the number of signals coming down here so that I get less. Essentially what I'm doing is I'm losing the control on this side, and I'm using a drug to reduce the control on this side so this becomes the dominant output. Whereas it should be the less dominant output. Yeah, it's crazy. I mean, any time you take a drug, you really should think about it. Every time you take a drug for something, your parents, your grandparents, your patients are taking a drug. There's amazing things going on in you. And the idea that we have drugs that can actually do anything is mind-boggling. All right, we're going to walk through each of those 4 disorders so that you have a better vision, I hope, of how the pathways disrupted. So in Huntington's disease, the striatum starts to degrade. A lot of the outputs that you lose initially are enkephalin outputs. Enkephalin is a neurotransmitter, okay? I mean, it has action within the brain besides pain mediation. So we're losing the whole output system here. And the only thing you can actually now control is this side, because this is the side that is going to be inhibiting, right? If this side works normally, I should get inhibition. So, the obvious approach to this is to degrade dopamine, get less signaling in here so that since we're losing this control, we're over signaling, so let's send less dopamine so you're slowing down this signaling pathway yet once again. Have I lost you on this one? So we lose this pathway in here, essentially. At least, and initially, it's going to degrade to where everything's gone. But you lose enkephalin, you lose this inhibition. Are we okay with that?
These drugs you're talking about, like
These are the
are they
typical,
supposed to be like beneficial to treating this?
yes, they are,
okay.
they
It's
are.
hard to tell because there's.
Oh, no, I didn't mean to imply they were non-beneficial drugs.
Okay.
All of the drugs I'm talking about through here, I just wanted, I thought I'd give you real-world examples showing how you affect the pathways. So you lose enkephalin, you lose this inhibition, therefore you have that inhibition, you lose this inhibition, you have over-excitation. All right? So you want to decrease excitation. Well, the only way you can decrease excitation at this point is to decrease it on this side. It will naturally decrease over time because the striatum is going to continue to degrade. But you want to ease the person into that total loss. So you use drugs that affect dopamine here so that you decrease the inhibition coming down here. You decrease the excitation coming in, which will decrease this, which will have a lesser effect on here. So we'll have more inhibition here, less glutamate here, more glutamate there. It's one of those things that really you have to sit down with a copy of the pathway and a pencil and go through and mark what happens. It really helps to do that. So ALS. ALS, you have just this tremendous effect on glutamate coming from the cortex. So you're not getting the signaling here, which means this pathway becomes totally inhibitory. You're just going to knock everything out down here because you're not getting the excitation here. Therefore, all of the inhibition from dopamine in the indirect pathway is going to turn this into a major inhibitory pathway. This is like turning on an off switch. So you have a tremendous reduction in the output. It's just this, excuse me, not a reduction in the output, but a reduction through here. We've reduced everything through here. So this inhibits, therefore this does nothing. This turns this on, this inhibits, we have no glutamate coming out here. So and this is on a sound, yeah.
Sorry, just to repeat, make sure I got it right. So there's, it doesn't produce glutamate from the cortex? That's what happens? Or there's a
Cortical production of glutamate, since the problem is in the cortex, has already dropped. So
Okay.
it doesn't make sense initially that you want to reduce glutamate production. All right? Initially. But what you have to say is, oh, look at this pathway. This glutamate. So in part, you're once again targeting this indirect pathway to reduce this glutamate because it's being overstimulated. Not overstimulated. This is totally inhibited. This isn't happening. So the subthalamic nucleus is now cranking glutamate in maximum numbers. Giving something that reduces glutamate production is not going to affect the cortex at this point. You already have a cortical reduction. This, it'll reduce a little bit, but this is critically important. You've got both sides here still producing some glutamate. So it kind of moderates the problem. Yeah. No, the disease knocks out cortical glutamate. Parkinson's, which you're going to all see in tremendous numbers. I mean, well, And as far as movement disorders go, Parkinson's probably gonna be a major player if you have a population that's an older population. So we have reduction in dopamine in both pathways, which is gonna turn this into a nightmare. You know, you're going to overstimulate here because you're going to lose this pathway mostly. So what you have to do is you've got a variety of possibilities. L-DOPA increases the production of dopamine. L-DOPA is the precursor to making dopamine. So the effects when you give L-DOPA is to essentially cause the cells in substantia nigra to up their production. So they're actually producing more dopamine. Now, those cells are still degenerating. So the degenerative process is going to continue, but at least early on in the disease, production of dopamine goes up. Early in the disease, it may totally eliminate symptoms. As the disease progresses, it moderates symptoms. Dopamine agonists. These would be chemicals that will bond to dopamine receptors as dopamine would. So that as dopamine production continues to drop, you're still getting some dopamine effects, even though you don't have dopamine. Anticholinergics. Acetylcholine, a lot of times in the striatum, will cause overproduction of output, because within the striatum, acetylcholine is the major neurotransmitter that's being produced. So without the inhibition here, we get overstimulation, once again, on the indirect pathway. So in the indirect pathway, this doesn't happen, but this is still, it's now in full control. These two signals, the glutamate and acetylcholine, are driving this to be completely inhibitory here. By giving an anticholinergic, we moderate this. Does that make sense? So, at least what I'm hoping you see through all of this is that dealing with these 4 movement disorders is complicated. We're going to look at a whole series of additional movement disorders today. And movement disorders are difficult. Movement disorders are a problem to deal with. Giving anticholinergics causes other problems. Why? Why would that cause problems?
Because it's everywhere in your body, your muscles,
Well, your neuromuscular junction is acetylcholine. You know, your autonomic nervous system, major neurotransmitter, acetylcholine. That's got to be dealt with very, very cautiously. So, you know, it's dealing with these disorders, balancing the drug treatments is really a complicated problem. So let's look at some other issues. Tourette syndrome. How many of you know Tourette syndrome? What do you know about Tourette syndrome? What? Twitches? Lots of what?
I said yelling. I'm thinking of the color one.
Okay.
They can't control what they're saying, they can't control.
Right. These are all referred to as tics. Yeah, the twitch is a tic. The verbal